Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this premiere of the Ancient Sea Peoples of the North Atlantic, a film by Ted Timericks. I'm David Brule. I'm the spokesman for the Nolumbeka Project. The Nolumbeka Project and the River Valley Co-op of East Hampton and Northampton are sponsoring this screening. The Nolumbeka Project is a nonprofit with a mission of facilitating interactions between tribal and non-tribal communities. As a case in point, our keynote event is the Pecumtuck Homelands Festival at Peskiomska, Montague, Massachusetts, where multiple indigenous nations participate in a music festival and sharing of crafts and histories. This year, the festival will occur on August 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. You can find out more detail on our website. And while you're on the website, please take the opportunity to make a donation. This will help us fund events like this one today. Our guest of honor is Doug Harris. He'll not be speaking, but his wife Genevieve will share Doug's thoughts later on in the program. This afternoon, we'll share the documentary, followed by a panel discussion featuring Paul Robinson and Bill Fitzhugh, with a question and answer session at the end. You'll also have the opportunity to make comments and ask questions via the chat box, which will be coordinated by Diane Dix of the Nolumbeka Project. Closed captions are available. For those desiring that feature, the CC button is located at the bottom of your screen. I'll now turn the program over to Ted Timericks.
Thank you, David. Our friends from Nolumbeka have asked me to make an introduction. So the Atlantic movie represents decades of documentation. It highlights the ideas and discoveries of many people whose research has slowly evolved into a new and different understanding of Northeastern Native history. Like the other programs in the Hidden Landscape series, this movie is a chronicle. The story begins in 1976 with the bitter controversy between the antiquarians and the professional archaeologists about the origins of the mysterious stone ruins in New England. It continues through the discovery of the red paint people and through the last several years of documenting offshore research along the submerged Atlantic continental shelf. Now, I could tell you stories about the research, but I find it hard to describe just what the movies are and what their effect on audiences may have been. To me, the moving image and the whole discipline of anthropology itself is an art form that's always changing. A shorthand example is the way that science keeps smashing the theoretical glass basement of indigenous history in the Western Hemisphere, and native time immemorial keeps stretching further back. The important thing is to keep realizing how much we still don't know, and that the story requires constant reimagining as we continue to learn. So I did something I've never done before. Based on a suggestion from my friend Will Getzman, who worked with me to formulate the original ideas that led to these chronicles, I went to a sophisticated artificial intelligence site and shamelessly asked about the anthropological movies of T.W. Timericks. A lot of material came back, but I'd like to offer you just the short conclusion of the collected information that the deep online search returned from across the web. Their conclusion: Timericks documentaries transcend mere educational tools. They are acts of epistemological reparation, restoring agency to indigenous peoples whose histories have been marginalized by terrestrial-centric archaeology. By illuminating the Algonquin Atlantic, his work compels a reevaluation of what constitutes civilization, privileging adaptability over monumentality. As rising oceans increasingly erase humanity's coastal heritage, Timericks' films serve as both elegy and blueprint, reminding us that the past, much like the sea, is never truly static. Future research must build on his interdisciplinary model, integrating traditional ecological knowledge with emergent technologies to navigate the submerged archives of our shared human journey. And I'd like to add one personal note. Today, we are lucky to have both Doug Harris and Bill Fitzhugh attending our screening. I've had the great good fortune of being able to work closely with both of them for decades. I think of them as representing the two main guardrails, native tradition on one side and Western science on the other. These two forces have helped me forge an artistic narrative path that always tried to find the balance. So let me run the movie.
Well, good. Well, good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a fascinating, uh, what can I say, list and just inventory of fantastic discoveries. Thank you for your patience with us at the beginning. We had a few technological difficulties. Technology can be a friend, but also a real frustrating source of frustration at times, but it all worked out. So I want to thank you very much. Um, if our technology is with us, I'd like to, before we Ted goes to introducing the panel, I'd like to see if Doug Harris and Genevieve are with us. They had some difficulty getting in, but let's see if they're there. Any? Hmm?
I don't see them.
Okay, right now the timing might be off. I did hear that Jen and Doug got into onto the site to watch the film, and I will defer to Ted, who will introduce the panel, and at some point, either Jen uh, or myself or Ted or Paul or Bill will talk to all of you about Doug Harris himself and what has been going on. But let's turn it over to Ted and go with the next part of this presentation, which will be a panel discussion.
Thank you, Dave. We have with us, feel so lucky, Bill Fitzhugh, who I've been associated with since 1979. And talk about benign and fruitful collaborations. This certainly has been one, because the idea that you can sit down with the scientists and just have a conversation where you find out really what they think, I find quite different than peer-reviewed papers. But that's the great pleasure of being able to do that kind of research. So I'd like to ask Bill to join us here with some thoughts about everything.
Well, thanks, Ted. Every time I see this film, and I've been watching Ted develop it for a couple of years, actually many years, because part of it goes way back to the late 1970s, 80s, and so on. So it's been a mammoth undertaking that Ted has shepherded all through, his film life and through the lives of many of us archaeologists. And as you notice from the film, quite a few of those people who are interviewed are no longer with us. So it's quite a fantastic thing when you think about most documentaries on archaeology, that sort of feature a single site or a discovery or some new research that's been done. And what Ted has pieced together here, across oceans and 50 years almost, is this epic journey that we've all been on, trying to understand a kind of early history, which was not really appreciated and still isn't very much appreciated, particularly in the northern regions, but also in the maritime areas as well. Much more easy to see how that has not been illuminated very much because of the difficulties of finding sites, and the technology of underwater work is just, developing, now really to where you can do things with submersibles and you don't have to have people with tanks down on the bottom and so forth. But my work with Ted really, began as we pushed this knowledge barrier north into areas that hadn't been investigated. And people have been doing Arctic archaeology for many years now, 100 years or more, but only from the Eskimo point of view and the high Arctic areas, whereas the maritime regions in the northern parts of continents were very slow to be incorporated into general archaeological practice. So we were very fortunate to be able to develop the work that we did in Labrador. We had the technology, the boats we needed to get around. We had the Smithsonian Institution, which was terrific as a research support place. And we also had the kind of like the lamplight of the public communication feature, which is such a strong part of the Smithsonian's program. So we combined the research and the opportunity to work with Ted to really document this and show how some of these very early peoples in the North were doing many more different and sophisticated kinds of things than we ever imagined. And, now we see these big stone tools, and, that's given us a lot of information about the kind of watercraft that they were making to use exploit these regions. So it's just been, Ted's shepherding this whole story over the years, and he's talking, promoting this idea of the maritime revolution, which really is a cool idea compared to the dominance of agriculture. But I also want to point out, I think that, what Ted has been doing is something much more than archaeology. He's been pushing the barrier for public information that should, I hope, eventually lead us to better understanding and protection of our marine resources with the help of people like Doug Harris and the important politics that goes with the indigenous peoples, and the urging of the governments to take archaeology responsibly underwater, as we need to develop the ocean resources and wind power and so forth. So Ted has been instrumental from so many levels. I just for his entire life and career as a way to try to inform American society and bringing scientists and amateurs and indigenous people into close, collaboration to realize the potential of understanding a better past. So thanks, Ted, and for all those years. And we're on the track, I think. So
That's
I'd be happy to
incredible.
answer other questions later, but that's kind of
Sure.
like my overall view of things.
Well, that's incredibly kind, but the truth is that you presented me with the most interesting problem that I could imagine as a filmmaker. It first of all, everybody was against it. It was just a setup to try and make sense out of those questions that we discussed on the edge of the beach at Nuliak Cove. It really made it worthwhile. So I see that Genevieve and Doug are with us.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Do you want to take it away, Dave? No.
You're on mute.
You're muted. this direction, Doug. Hi. Hello, everyone.
Jen, go ahead. Hey.
Doug and I are here at Spalding Rehab Hospital in Cambridge, Mass. And unfortunately, at this time, Doug is on a respirator, but generally he's doing very, very well. And what we wanted to say was that Doug had been involved since childhood in going to ceremony at what his parents and grandparents on both sides would describe as going to Cherokee. And it meant the Cherokee ceremonies that were held nearby where they lived. Doug grew up in North Carolina, Wilkesboro, North Carolina, and there was a reservation not too far. So since childhood, he was part of it. And when he was in his 40s, he met Ted, and at that point, he had become a tribal historic preservationist with the Narragansetts, which is funded by the National Park Service. And he began filming with Ted, researching with Ted, and you saw the results of it. Obviously, this isn't everything that they filmed together, but it is an incredible showing that tells a particular story. And both Doug and I would like to congratulate Ted. I went into the International Anthropological Documentary Site, and for 2024, the list was an arm long in terms of the entries. And Ted won first place for 2024. So not only do we think this is absolutely fabulous and tells us a story that is rarely told, but apparently the scientific community sees this as a valuable asset. And the photography is fabulous, the narration is fabulous, and the scientific background is proven. So once again, thank you and congratulations, Ted, and everyone who is part of this endeavor.
Thank you, and all of our best to Doug.
Yes, thank you, Jen. I'm still looking at the number of participants, and I know that each and every one of them likely has a story or multiple stories about how Doug has influenced their lives. And I could go on, but it wouldn't be fair because I have the monopoly of the conversation right now. But we had thank you, Jennifer, and it's great, Genevieve, and it's great to see Doug again. I know he's been looking forward to this for a long, long time.
Yes.
So this is most excellent to see you both there together. And of course, everyone wishes a speedy recovery. We're looking forward to seeing him back out in the field as soon as it's possible. And I know you've said he's so strong, he's going to do that. So there are a lot of people who would be well-wishing for Doug, and I know that most people have a way of communicating with Doug via email or else Facebook or whatever. So I do encourage people to do that. In a little bit, there will be a opportunity for some questions. Diane Dix is compiling the questions as best she can. And we just finished listening to Bill Fitzhugh's first remarks, and it's high time to turn it over to Paul Robinson, who's been very patiently listening and watching and waiting for a chance to say something. So take it away, Paul.
Okay, can you hear me and see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I can just talk. It's my turn.
You got it.
The film is a wonderful film, and and it has many lessons, and there are many parts that are important. But the lesson that I took away from the film, from what Doug said in the film and what Ted's main narrative was, is that archaeologists and historians ignore, am I still there?
Yeah.
You're good.
The archaeologists and historians ignore the oral history, the indigenous oral history, at their own peril. When I arrived, I guess, as state archaeologist in Rhode Island in around 1980, I was told by the people running the state that the Narragansett Indian tribe did not exist. There were no Indians. I began working with them anyway and found out pretty shortly that the state was wrong. And in particular, I was working with Ella Sikatow that Ted included in his film, and she is this great source of oral history. The oral history is a gift to anyone who wants to listen to it. When Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island in 1636, showed up, he had a conversation with one of the sachems in the area, a guy named Pesicus. And so Williams was curious European. One of the great characteristics of Europeans is we are curious, sometimes to our own detriment. But he was asking questions. One of the questions he asked Pesicus was, how long have you people lived around Narragansett Bay? And Pesicus told him, or Williams translated it, as since time out of mind, for a long time. And so, as Kevin says in the film, Kevin McBride says in Ted's film, archaeologists who started out with this idea that Indians arrived here maybe 10,000 years ago just got it totally wrong. But Indian people were telling me since I arrived in 1980 that they've been here since time out of mind. They've been here 25,000 years, that they emerged from the earth or they fell from the sky. And the longer archaeologists work in this area, the older and older and older it gets. And the closer and closer and closer the story gets to the story of the oral history. So we ignore the oral history at our own peril. And we sometimes think that the original gift of Indian people to the colonists was the corn that enabled those pilgrims to survive that first awful winter. But bundled up in that corn is the oral history. The oral history is a wonderful gift that we ignore at our own peril. And I think, Ted, you did a wonderful job of bringing that out in your film and letting Doug tell us in his own words why it was so important. And the oral history springs from the tribes who have been here since time out of mind, as represented by Ella Sikatow, the tribal medicine woman that you featured in your film, and you were lucky to have her. So more and more of us, I mean, some archaeologists think of oral history as just hearsay, singular, particularistic stories that we just can't use. But I think we ignore it at our own peril, and we've got to use it. So that's what I got to say. That's my comment. I could go on more. Oh, now, Doug Harris comes across in that film as this very mild-mannered, very thoughtful guy. But I know from working with him for years, when I was in the SHPO office and he was in the THPO office for Narragansett, that guy has courage and tenacity that you would not believe. He's faced down bulldozers, cigar-chomping bullies that wanted to destroy sites, stands up to them, blunders through the briars to stop these guys. Used to call me all times of the day and night. Anyway, wake me up. Anyway, the guy's got courage, tenacity, and strength, and I know he's going to get better. And so there's it. That's my story, and I'm done with it. So thank you. Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Paul. My own little story before we go to Diane. Hopefully she'll be compiling some of the questions now. I met both Paul and Doug at the Turners Falls Airport, the controversy that happened there. And Doug was rock solid in maintaining that the ceremonial stones on that hillside next to the airport were keeping the area in balance. And having grown up in that particular town, I've said to myself, boy, we definitely need balance around here.
Yeah.
And that battle that Doug led along with the Mashpee Wampanoag and the Aquinnah with the Narragansett Tribal Historic Preservation Office behind them. That battle was won and that hill is preserved, and it is preserved in perpetuity now, again, thanks to Doug's tenacity. But we were looking for something else to do, and Paul came up with the idea that we should go to the National Park Service to try to find a way to get some funding to study that horrific massacre that happened in King Philip's War at the falls that we call Peskiomscut, which unfortunately is called Turner's Falls after the man who led the genocide. And that study has been going on now for 12 years, and we meet every month with tribal officers and local historical commission people, and Doug was part of that for at least the first 9 years. And Paul was there as well for the first number of years, every month. So that is something that has transformed this area. And I really, we all of us who know, really, really owe Doug a tremendous amount of gratitude. And we thank Paul for taking a role in getting there. So I'm going to see if Diane Dix, who is our impresario, and if Diane has some questions either for the panel or for Genevieve and Doug.
Actually, I do, but not very many. So I would encourage people to write their questions into the Q&A if you would like any of the panelists to answer you. The first question that comes up is a question about whether or not you have any information about Iceland.
Iceland. Well, there's a lot out there. I'm not sure what kind of information you're searching for.
That was the question.
Is this the Iceman in from Europe? Is that the idea?
Or Iceland, the island.
Yeah.
Iceland?
Yes, it's capitalized.
Iceland?
Yeah,
Iceland.
What do we want to know about Iceland? Well, there's an awful lot to say about Iceland. I mean, that's the home of Eric the Red and all the rest. I wonder what the question is focused on. It was the way station for the Norse to get to Greenland, and after Greenland colony went extinct, a lot of people resettled in Iceland and so forth. It's got a lot of great archaeological work that's been done there by local people. Kevin Smith has done some recent work there in a cave where they found a lot of Norse ritual materials in the north side of Iceland. It's very interesting because they became very quickly Christianized in Iceland, but they kept up a lot of their traditional pagan and earlier beliefs at the same time. It's of course that's where they keep the great Norse saga kept in Iceland. And they're a tremendous resource for the understanding of the whole Norse expansion and the settlement of Greenland and Lanza Meadows and the Vinland sagas.
Thank you. And Gundy, who wrote this question, is welcome to ask anything more specific if this didn't help. Andrew Grant wrote that he winced at hearing about fishing trawlers pulling up native burials. Do the fishermen have any legal obligations in this regard?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I would assume there's some kind of responsibility. Obligation, I don't know if that's the right word, but I'm guessing that anyone would have the responsibility to deal with it.
Yeah, it would be federal law. I thought, but I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Federal law of some kind.
Sam Bishop would like to have everyone's contact information. And I'm not exactly sure how we can do that right now, but we could share that on the Nolumbeka Project website, or we could share it in our email. So what we can do is get everybody's contact information and have it available to anybody who writes to Nolumbeka Project at gmail.com, and we will have that for you. We have another, just a comment from Rebecca Fraser, who is Genevieve and Doug's daughter. This is not a question, but a comment. I met Doug only 2 years before he was hospitalized and his voice was stolen. And while I was listening, I was not truly comprehending the significance of his work with ceremonial stone landscapes. This film has given me, his stepdaughter, a new understanding of the work and its importance. I am inspired. Thank you, Ted, for this beautiful, fascinating film. And here's a very good question, and I was sorry we forgot to mention it earlier. When and where, how will Ted's film be available for the public to view? Thank you. Ted, you can answer that.
Sure. It's ever since the 1980s, I've been attached to a company called Bullfrog Films. And it's like everything else I've done, it's this lucky combination, because Bullfrog is probably the premier, foremost environmental distributor of movies in the country today. They're really devoted to it and really good at picking their material, and it's an honor to even be in there. They don't have an anthropological section per se, although they do have just a few anthropological pieces, including several of mine, because of the way that, underneath what we're saying here is that the environment shapes our culture in ways that we haven't been aware in the past, and now we're getting to be our own round of new awareness of how environment is shaping our culture. But that's, I think, the reason that John Abrahall, who runs Bullfrog Films, has seen that the movies we make with the scientists and with the native perspectives are a good fit with his environmental mandate. Bullfrog is simple to look up. It's just bullfrog.org, and everything can go from there. Or you can even go to my website and catch it there. So it's out there. It's out there. It's such controversial stuff. I mean, I used to make more movies for television, but frankly, as I go to the edges, that kind of audience gets a little further away. And fortunately, there are groups like Nolumbeka where dedicated, intelligent folks are here to get the latest information that you're not going to see this stuff on TV. I mean, God knows what you do. I mean, I know what you do see. We don't have to talk about that. But I guess that's a problem. And yet here it has a really good distribution vehicle for itself. So I can't do anything more than that. And I have never put energy into having people to building audiences. I mean, I have all the time should go into making the movies, and the pleasure of this is, and this one has been pleasurable for half a century now. You can imagine when you start with nothing but speculation and a lot of scientific backlash and native backlash at the same time. And we just had to build this up over these decades and decades. And fortunately, I've had Doug on one side and I've had Bill on the other, and they've allowed me to feel like I can tell a narrative that goes in between and winds up being balanced.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say, maybe as add on to that is that Ted is it's really important to try to. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. It just disappeared on me there. Sorry.
Too bad.
I'm gonna
That was a good
quiet.
one. But it'll come back. Give it a moment.
Yeah. I would like to mention that there's a number of people that have hands up, and we're really only taking questions through the questions and the answers. So if you can write your questions, then that would be great.
Oh, yeah, right.
Right. Michael Patnode is a researcher, and he asks, are there any recommendations from the panel for a researcher, myself, to engage with these stories to inform my research? I am an independent researcher out of Chicopee, engaged in studying the history of the land through an environmental anthropological lens. Thank you.
Well, could I make some suggestions, Julie? We talked about the importance of oral history, and I think an independent researcher might want to pursue that. And there are a number of women, especially scholars, who are working on the oral history these days. You probably know about Lisa Brooks. I think she's at Amherst College. Or Christine DeLucia. She's at Williams. Lucy Ann Lavin, is at the museum in Connecticut. And she just published a book with Elaine Thomas called Our Hidden Landscapes. It's a collection of essays. It includes something in it by Doug Harris. It's a lovely book. I highly recommend it. Ruth Herndon, a historian who worked with Ella Sikatow. So I would suggest that you pursue indigenous scholars that are working in history and anthropology, and see where that takes you.
Suggest, almost many different regions have archaeological societies. Most states have their societies, and some regional areas also. So there's a lot of ways to get involved in archaeological work if you're interested in field work, or all the universities have lecture programs and things like that. So there's a real place for the amateur in archaeology, and fortunately we're coming together after quite a long period of disjunction between those two groups. But there's a lot of stuff out there if you just start looking, nosing around.
If I could jump in too, one of the things that, since you're in Chicopee, not far from us, one of the things that I think is really fascinating as a source, you'd have to piece it together, but would be indigenous place names in our valley here. If you were to look into some of the original deeds where these place names were listed, you might find, especially in terms of an environmental architecture archaeology, you might find some fairly interesting clues to pursue. But place names, some of which still exist, such as Chicopee, and the falls where we are at Pesquiomscut, all of these place names carry deep meaning for indigenous peoples. The challenge, of course, would be to find out an indigenous person who is capable of helping you understand what that means. But that's just my 2 cents. I think that's a fascinating, let's say, pathway to follow.
I could add to that my own work, starting in the 70s, when I would go out with those antiquarians like Jim Mavor and Byron Dix and Jim Whittall and Betty Zinzerbo, the clues that I found to be valuable were the names on the topo maps. The names, just as one hint, when you came up in New England with the name, anything named the devil this or the devil that, the devil's footstep, the devil's hop yard, those are legacies of Puritan interpretation. But those kinds of names usually refer back to native ceremonial sites. Now, what you have to do as a young explorer there is you have to find the topo maps that go back further, because they change the names on the topo maps. And the further you go back on the date of a published topo map, the better chance you have of finding these old Indian names. Just like you said, there are several Indian names and there are these other kinds of collections. But when you see the relationship between these things, it gives you a different map of the whole area. And it allows you to think about it in a different way. It certainly helped me way, way, way back in the beginning. And by the way, that was my series called Hidden Landscapes. You can find all of that information.
And while you're speaking, Ted, somebody wants to know what your website is.
It's just www.twtimrec, that's TWTIMRECK.com.
And Trace Hentz would like to know who would pay for research on the continental shelf in the East. How can we move?
I can address that.
Okay.
Doug could really do it, but I'll give you when the large corporations want to sink their pylons in for wind turbines or gas and oil, the law says that the ground that they're going to disturb needs to be vetted. It needs to be explored. It needs to be searched for the potential for cultural resource. It's all very rubbery. The business of requiring the corporations to do that due diligence first. Doug and I worked for 5 years with the University of Rhode Island to try to set out protocols for these companies to have some kind of rules to interface between tribes, the government, and their actual construction. That was very tough. It ebbs and flows, as you know, with politics and money, but the law still exists that we should look before we destroy. And that's a really good law. And here's the underlying part of that. If you're going to build 100 wind turbines, all evenly spaced, you could think of that as one of the best scientific samples of all time on the shelf. If you have evenly spaced excavations on the floor of the submerged shelf, you have yourself a chance to make some very statistical analysis, and it could be worthwhile. But everybody has to. In Denmark, that footage you saw, the Danes really support what they're coming up with. They're very interested in what those museums are finding. Every year they're finding these new sites and new discoveries, and they have a large audience that's interested in figuring out what those ancestors are about. We could have probably the same thing if anybody realized that our edges were just as valuable.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that because, that is an amazing thing. What the Scandinavians, and particularly the Danes, have done with their underwater work. And, I've been working up in the northern regions. We sometimes have the Inuit and Eskimo sites that are permanently frozen, and you get a wonderful glimpse, into their cultures from the preserved wood and bone and text sorts of stuff. It's just unbelievable when you have a permafrost site, what you actually find. And what we usually have in the northern parts of North America is just the stone tools and maybe a few bone things, but mostly stone tools. And we found that the stone tools are maybe only 1% of the cultural inventory of these northern sites that have wood and bone and so forth. In Scandinavia and in Denmark, they've been pulling this stuff up for, 8,000-year-old sites with absolutely unbelievable material. Like these, I still can't get over green leaves down there in the sediments, but I do understand the ivory and the bone, and it's just beautiful. So it just shows you how much resource is out there, and the importance of trying to get governments and corporations to help out, because that kind of archaeology these days is got to be the most expensive. It's like flying to the moon. for an archaeologist to get out. And that's why Sinmar has not been explored properly either, just because the governments and the regulators and so forth are not real keen on letting us onto the shelf. I just hope that we'll see a change in some future, political arenas here, so that we can actually do a proper job at beginning to learn what we really don't know at all about these early cultures, because it's all there, it's underwater, and it's going to be amazing.
The problem behind that is that the public, by and large, imagines that the world we see today is the same world that the ancestors saw going back any amount of time, thousands of years. And we're learning now the hard way that that's not the case, that the shape of our worlds, the shape of our water systems, which really does shape culture, has been changing all this time. And consequently, there's good reason to imagine that there's plenty of it underneath that water. And granted, it's expensive, and we may have to wait God knows how long before we can afford easily, technologically, to do the work. But the problem is that the public itself doesn't have the idea that we live in an environment that has changed shape over time. And consequently, because they think archaeology takes place on the land the way it's here now and always has been.
Yeah, well, our friend is going to be technology in that, because you can envision 20, 30, 50 years from now, the kind of remote sensing devices that may be available.
Right.
You may be able to get a picture of those underwater sediments in great detail.
Yeah, I'll bet we'll never have another archaeological excavation in the very near future. Nobody will dig anything again. Can't wait.
Somebody asked, is there any evidence or stories of Native Americans encountering the Vikings?
Bill?
The Mi'kmaq of northern Nova Scotia have some stories that they believe times, that's 1,000 years ago. They have these stories of these strange people coming in big boats and so forth. So that's a pretty well established tradition, oral tradition, as we've been hearing about. So it's very difficult to pin a time frame on that, though, and there's nothing in those traditions that Doug may know, or Paul may know more about it, but one has been able to actually say, yes, indeed, these do go back to Viking era. The Mi'kmaq were an amazing culture with maritime capabilities. It was probably very similar to what existed on the northeast coast of the U.S., before everything was disrupted by the Europeans. But there's a century and a half of amazing Mi'kmaq maritime capabilities when they were, with the big guns in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, traders, and it was pretty amazing what they were doing. But so some of those stories they have may not go back to Viking times, but to some maybe very, very early times around 1500. But essentially, we just don't have that kind of information, except from some of the people, some of the Inuit in northern Greenland. Aaron of Kongek was an artist who recreated a lot of oral history pictorially of contacts between the Thule people and the Viking people in southern part of Greenland, and that's a pretty rich source of information. Generally, very little, though.
Yeah,
If I could say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. In Paul, I had talked to you about this maybe 2 years ago, but I've been doing a lot of research, and my grandmother was Nellie Thompson. And if you go back 13 generations, there's David Thompson. There's a Thompson Island in Boston Harbor. And David Thompson was with Miles Standish in 1621 and he showed him, and this is part of the Massachusetts archives. At any rate, they testified before the magistrates that, or Miles Standish testified that he stood on Thompson's Island in 1621, and David showed him a very ancient map with the Isle Thompson on it. Now, David, according to the original Massachusetts grant from 1622, and I own a copy of it, which I located at the National Archives in Kew Garden outside of London. But David Thompson was the original, he was designated as the original governor of the Massachusetts by the Council for New England, and they were the legal body that gave out the grants. And in fact, the Plymouth Plantation grant was underwritten by the Council for New England. The chief person was the Duke of Lennox, Ludwig Stewart, who was King James's cousin. And the second person who signed the document was Thomas Howard, the Earl of Arundel. Many of you will remember the great heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They always showed the Dutch room and the empty frames, and in the middle is a knight in shining armor. That is Thomas Howard, the Earl of Arundel. At any rate, he was great friends with David Thompson, and I found a 3-page letter, which is a mini history unto itself. But
Genevieve, in all due respect, can you reach the Vikings for us or somebody?
Yes, I'm about to do that.
Good, thanks.
Okay, I needed to give you the background. At any rate, having worked on the genealogy for like 30 years, I traced David back to Carstophan, Scotland, outside of Edinburgh. He was a direct descendant of the Sinclairs. The Sinclairs there's this whole mythology about they were here 100 years before Columbus was. At any rate, that is David's family. His grandmother's brother built Rosslyn. If anyone's seen the Da Vinci Code, you'll know what I'm talking about. At any rate, I have located a document from Henry, I think it's King Henry I archives from 1404 that lists Henry Sinclair. This would be the son of the Henry Sinclair that originally came in 1398 or whatever. The document in England says that Henry Sinclair requested permission to go through the channel off into the Atlantic, and with him was the merchant John Thompson, and we're talking about 1404, and this is an English document, which basically could potentially relate to Miles Standish standing before the magistrates and saying in 1621, David Thompson showed him a very ancient map, and the Isle Thompson was on it. Now, the Sinclairs were from Orkney, which is part of what we just saw, and they are descended from, many say, Danish and Swedish ancestry, the Vikings, basically. So that's my 2 bits. It's not 1,000 years ago, but we're talking about 1404. and earlier, if you believe the other stories, which involve native contacts with this man, Henry Sinclair, and his crew.
Thanks, Genevieve.
Yeah,
Yep.
we have a question which is different. We have a lot of praise for you, Ted, and for you, all of you, but Ted, you in particular, about the film and things that people have learned. But here's a question that's just a little different, and I'd be interested in hearing how people answer it. This is from Ellen. I was honored to meet Doug at Sunray and hear what he had to say, just sort of giving us a small sense of how to look at the land. So much appreciation for you, Doug, and your lifetime of work. Thank you, Ted, everyone, for this film. When I was looking at this film, I felt I saw images of people in the cliffs or rocks. For me, it felt so purposeful and obvious that I wondered if the filmmakers put it in there. I do not feel this, just that the images were so strong. Could you comment on some of the images of what looked like indigenous people in the rocks and cliffs?
Whoa. You bring up a strange point, in that I cited that artificial intelligence material from the web that's come back, and there was a significant argument in there about whether or not I used special camera angles to create drama. And the gist of it was that no, I never used any special angles. I always tried to focus completely on the people and make sure that you never thought about the filmmaker at all. Because when you do a fancy angle or something like that, it brings the sense of the filmmaker right up to the audience's front side. And after years of work, I've decided that that's exactly what you don't want to do. So it couldn't be anything better than for people to see more in any frame than is there, or it's there and all the rest of us don't see it. It doesn't matter. But I have worked very hard to minimize the idea that anybody would think the filmmakers were doing anything other than conveying what are the exact ideas of the people we talk to. Or I'd certainly like the scenery to be as truthful. But I think what our viewer has just pointed out is that scenery is more than truthful always. It just simply is that way.
That's a great comment, Ted. And I've actually, as a curator, I've received quite a lot of materials from people who see things in materials. Like I got a rock delivered to my office that somebody said was the head, a likeness of the head of George Washington. It was a round boulder that didn't have to George, as far as I can see. And then people send me, things they find in the desert out west. And a lot of this stuff one person sent was sprue from like when you're making melting lead bullets, and you spill the lead into the sand, and this created for this person, all these images of things, of animals and creatures. And we see a lot of this. We see people sending in things that they say, here's an elephant. You can see it's a Paleolithic, elephant from North America. You can see the tusks here and there. So the point is that people have, as Ted, suggests, people have a remarkable ability to find things, in other materials that no one else can see but them.
I have a motto. I have a motto when I work with people in the field or interview them. And it's a very simple: never get between anyone and their creation myth. And I think the idea of seeing in the world is just the beauty of being human. And it's a remarkable a remarkable quality that humans have, and we should celebrate it and think no other way about it.
I think there's an implicit obligation of place and what the viewer has said. I mean, there's this idea in southern Rhode Island that the cedar trees on the ridgeline stand guard, for all time, and they represent people who have lived in the area for thousands of years. So it's really a beautiful thought, and I think it connects with people's ideas about our obligations to place, which I think is another message in your film, that we need to take care of our places, don't we? They've been here for a long time, and let's hope they remain for a long time. And if we have guardians helping us, so much the better.
They shape our thoughts.
I think so.
Environment shapes our culture.
And as for underwater research, I mean, I don't know how much longer we're going to be leasing offshore lands for wind turbines. I mean, we're headed for a difficult time, the next few years, for a number of reasons, not just wind turbines.
Right. But as long as the laws stay the same, we've got that.
Yeah, as long as. Yeah.
Diane, you got some gems. What else?
I know. I really like that one too. Tim Fole wants to know about the underwater shots. Were they taken on the continental shelf?
Oh yes, absolutely. Those are Dave Robinson's photography. He's a wonderful underwater. He's a scientist, and he takes really good underwater pictures. He's been doing it for a long time, and we were lucky to work with him, and he sent me many reams of underwater stuff that is very effective and very beautiful. I mean, that's really good stuff that he's got. I don't see how I could have done it without it.
We had a couple questions also about the use of LiDAR images and whether you use those. And that's a question.
That's a good question. I have never used LiDAR because I'm really happy with looking with my own eyes at aerial footage. And I can't afford LiDAR as near as I can tell. But I think that it really works best if you're in the Amazon rainforest, for instance. I think that's where it's becoming most valuable to us. But I'm sure Bill has a wider perspective on it than I do, or Paul.
I don't. I mean, I've used aerial photography in my work, drone photography, things like that. So yeah, it's a tool that's great when you have vegetation cover.
But we work in the north that has hardly any vegetation.
Relatively little. No, you're right. In South America, Central America, it's a tremendous tool, but it's not always suitable anywhere else. If we could see underground, through the ground, that would help. That would help more.
Lord Ted, is there a form of a LiDAR that may be developed or about to be developed where you could take a form of LiDAR and use it on the ocean floor?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I'm sure it's in our future.
Yeah, one of our audience members, Pam Kimball, who we all know, has this question for everybody. How does everyone on the panel imagine the best ways that we can support the continued success of the expansion and deepening of maritime native cultural history?
Oh, okay. I think about that a lot. My favorite is to try to go back to the beginning. We've all mentioned time immemorial, and I've been thinking about this a great deal, in the sense that in in the Western Hemisphere, archaeologists have not, by habit, excavated very deeply. And it's always been a joke because Clovis was first, and Clovis doesn't go back past that 13,000-year barrier, according to our textbooks and many of our working scientists, I guess. But I'm quite sure that the time immemorial of native concept is going to be important, because digging deeper, we're eventually going to find a piece of a finger bone, a molar, part of a jaw, and it will probably be a hominin, a human ancestor that we are not familiar with. We are finding them all over the globe as we speak. They're popping up surprisingly in short order in different places, because we're digging in the South Pacific and we're digging in in Siberia. As we expand our normal excavation concepts or research, I think we're going to find that very little bit of a Denisovan finger, not necessarily that species, but it'll be one from America, from the Americas, and therefore we will eventually have time immemorial deeper and deeper, and that should be the next step. Now, it may very well be underwater in an anaerobic situation if we find a burial. And so consequently, that's all the more reason for us to try to get to doing whatever research we can. It may be way after us, but hopefully if we public to be aware of the importance of searching, they'll be able to uphold the laws we have as strongly as possible. You guys have another idea that's better?
Well, I'm thinking about the Smithsonian. I mean, we need institutions that have been here for a while and will continue to be here for a while. We need continuity. We need institutional memory. We need people passing the work on from generation to generation. It can't just go in fits and starts. There needs to be a continuous flow, like the Woonasquatucket River, it's continuously flowing. So that would be my advice. And so my hat's off to Bill and the Smithsonian for being here for a long time, and may you always be here.
Yeah, well, I'm 1 foot in the Smithsonian now. I'm started in a partial retirement, frame here, and I'm hoping that the Arctic Studies Center may continue in some way. I've got, Stephen Loring is there, Igor Krupnik is there. Back in the, in the couple of decades or 15 years ago, I guess it was more like, I got quite interested in trying to convince the Smithsonian to establish an underwater program. And Dennis Stanford was then, starting to play with Sinmar and so forth. And we hit a wall, and we weren't able to really get the institution to buy into it, even though that we've had, underwater work has been quite prominent. What we really need is a broader approach that's not just a historical approach, but is an anthropological approach to the seabed, because that's where the history of humankind is best preserved these days, and it's not subject to the kind of destruction that we have in so many land sites these days. Projects get bigger and so forth. So the resource is there, and I would hope that someone at the Smithsonian will wake up, but our problem now is we're having a lot of bureaucratic issues about, legal issues and everything. It's getting much more complicated, much more expensive to do anything. My feeling is that some of the universities are going to need to band, to band together. And, there's some very good underwater programs around the country and around the world. But biggest area where this is being pushed forward is in Europe, is in Scandinavia.
DNA is another exploratory tool. Both Doug and I have very ancient, in the sense that we both have Native American ancestry in our background. And we both, through 23andMe, show Asian ancestry as well as that. But then Doug has one additional feature along with Native and Asian. He has ancient Australian Indian DNA, as well as Filipino Indian DNA in his ancestry. And where does that come from? Who else was here? You know, they weren't just traveling along the Beringian landmass to get here. In coming by boats from the Atlantic, who else came here? And did they all intermix and become what today are the various tribal groups of North America?
And I just want to say,
I'm going to say this. I think it's about time for us to wind up and finish this. So let's just go.
Thanks, Brent.
I agree. I thought I would ask one last question that's listed from one of the people in the audience, and then people can wind down. Is that okay?
Sure.
This is
That's fine.
about
Yeah.
Vermont. And this person would like to know whether or not you could tell her where the site that was circled on the map of Vermont depicting a location of trading in ancient times is. And could she contact you for that, Ted? And she said, is it part of the Abenaki lands near Swanton?
Yes, of course. It's Western Abenaki for sure. And if it's the same thing I'm thinking she's thinking about, it's that beach terrace. It's just by the side of the road. Those huge dunes that used to be the beaches of the Champlain Sea, or the Iroquois Sea, if you like. That's the site. And it's a great place to, muck about.
Well, that's the end of the questions.
Good.
Thank you. Then, Brent Pitcher, our technician, is obviously noting the clock. We've been going for almost 2.5 hours, if not more. So we will draw to close. I want to certainly thank Paul and Bill for having participated in this, and certainly Ted, who has invested a tremendous amount of time just with us in the last week, but all of these decades of work. And special thanks to Genevieve and Doug Harris, who, of course, Doug has spent a lifetime working on this material, and we wouldn't be where we are today without having Doug covering the landscape with many of us. So it's a huge debt of gratitude that we owe Doug. I'd like to thank Diane Dix also for fielding the questions and helping pull this together. And I think at this stage, I'll just see if Ted would like to say some final words about wrapping this up. And I'm just very, very grateful that Ted has been willing to share all of this with the Nolumbeka project, but with all of the public. So, Ted, you want to close out with a few words?
David. Sure. And I would like to, Doug and Bill are just the two forces that I could work in between that really facilitated all of this. The questions come from them, the answers come from them, and all of the people they're connected to. And Paul is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the very first to get out in the field with Doug and myself from the professional anthropological business and sit down and say, we got to take a look at this stuff. We really have to think about it differently. So for me, this was a very lucky assemblage of folks. It couldn't ask for a better combination, and Nolumbeka is just the right organization to be able to pull that together. Thank you.
Thank you all. everyone, I hope you have a good Sunday evening, and thank you for being here. It was great meeting Bill Fitzhugh, and good to see Paul again. And of course, Genevieve and Doug, we stay in regular contact. So thank you all. We will say goodbye for now.